All right, in this video, we're going to tackle sculpting Gurgi and Henwen, the two creatures that flank our main character, Taran of Caer Dallben, in the Black Cauldron sculpt. I lost the first part of the footage here, so I'm going to try and quickly go back over the part that I had lost. First thing I do is I select everything on Taran, save off a new file, and simple merge it. Go to the Geometry tab, and I decimate it. Get it pretty low poly, so he's almost like a Nintendo 64 model. And the reason I do that is to really just focus all my memory of Nomad on the next sculpt. So on Henwen that I'm going to tackle first, I'll add a plane for the floor. And then I'm going to start blocking in Henwen with some spheres and the move tool. And once again, this isn't going to be 100% exact. You're going to see where I end up in a little bit, but I'm following the same steps. Adding a sphere, moving things around, add another sphere. I'm going to rotate this sphere for the head off angle to match the pose of the head. And even though it's a sphere, you can hardly tell which way it's facing, but if you look at the gizmo tool, you'll see where that line is. Then if I turn on symmetry and go to local instead of world, I can continue working in symmetry on Henwen's head, but still having it off angle at the same time. I'm going to add some tubes for legs. I'll keep the middle point in the tube sharp, as that's where the knee or elbow is. And I'll add a point at the very top and pull that into the body. And then at some point I'm going to go to the topology and increase my subdivisions there so it's a little bit smoother. I'll duplicate that around and just repose the legs as need be. All right, and then once I get happy with that, I'm going to start adding in an ear. I'm going to do that with a cube that I'll remesh, and then I will trim that remesh. I keep a pretty low resolution on the remesh here because I'm going to be smoothing it and really just pulling in the basic shapes. So here you can see I'm reshaping it to match kind of the ear tip. And I'll also create another cube and remesh it and put that as the first part of the ear. Before I do that, I'm going to start using the sharp brush to mark in my main parts of the shapes of the face. And really this is about where I left off when I lost that first recording. So I'm going to cut here and we'll resume. This is really where I was in the first part of the sculpt. Again, really close to what you just seen. I just done a little bit more with the sharp brush and move tool to get that face shape in. We'll use the flatten on the snout. Get everything looking good. From here, I'm going to duplicate the other ear tip and put that into place. Move things around, smooth it. Again, you want a low resolution on your voxel remesh here so it's easy to smooth out and get those main shapes in. Here I'm adding another cube. This will be the base of the ear. We'll pose that, do a low resolution voxel remesh and shape it in place. And then I will voxel merge the two and then start blending those together once I'm happy with those two parts of the ear. And then just smooth and reshape with the flatten tool. Just get that all dialed in. All right, working in some of the mouth with the clay brush and the sharp brush. I'm going to add in the other part of the ear, same as I did it on that first one. As you can see, most of these process videos that I do here are very much the same thing over and over. Occasionally there's some new sort of problem solving and tips and tricks, and sometimes I just kind of wrestle with it until I get it the way I want. So for instance, this ear didn't quite bend. I didn't have it rotated into shape when I started using that move tool quite as much, so I had to go back in, use some clay buildup, use the flatten, just rinse and repeat until you really get the shape you're after. Here I've got the head in pretty good position, getting it refined. Once again, I'm matching an illustration, a 2D illustration here. So while I keep going back to a main hero angle to check that, I also want to make sure it still looks good in 3D too. Adding a lump of fat on the neck with clay buildup tool and then the sharp tool. sharp brush. Once again, that's the sharp brush that I make. It's basically the brush tool with a sharp fall off. I tend to like that a little bit better than the crease tool. I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between those two brushes, but I just like the result I get with a sharp fall off on my brush. A little bit better. Here's just refining. I still kind of have a low resolution on the face because I don't quite have all my main features 100% there yet. I'm going to add a tube and create the little curly tail. Very simple. Once again, I love the tube brush in Nomad. Very easy to use, very intuitive. And I've got the radius turned on for all points on the tube tool, so I can really tweak the thickness as it goes around. Going in, doing some simple renaming and cleanup. And now I'm going to voxel merge the head with the body and smooth that out. There's not, in the main illustration, main drawing, there's not a hard cutoff where that head hits the body. So you really do need to merge them, get them where they need to be. Once again, why I haven't really messed with refining the head just yet, because I want to make sure I got the body merged in there first. But I'll go ahead and increase my resolution. I may have just subdivided. Sometimes it's just easy enough to subdivide rather than remesh. You just really need to kind of go back and forth and see what you like. I'm going to add in some spheres for the eyes here. Be sure, keep everything labeled. It's very easy to end up with tons and tons of layers, and if you don't have things labeled, it gets confusing really quick. I'm going to use a mask off for the pupils so I can really see where those are as I build the forms around the eyes. Make sure that the expression's reading correctly. All right, moving things around, just refining that face. Creating Gurgi here will be a very similar process. I'm getting pretty close already. Henwen doesn't take nearly as long as Terran because everything's pretty simple, pretty basic geometry. Get the legs looking proper, just meshing with thickness before I then merge them into the body and then start smoothing where those two connect. Use the clay buildup to build up kind of the fat and the muscle around where the legs intersect with the body, also with the sharp brush too. Smooth it out. At this point, it's really just a matter of getting the lines, the folds in the body to read in the same way that they read in the illustration too. And here I'll use the sharp brush where it doesn't have subtract on, so it actually kind of pulls out a sharper edge around the lids and the snout. I'm going to add in a tube for the lashes, just to make sure those really stand out. I could do this with painting, but it'll probably end up looking better just as geometry, especially in 3D. And create smaller tubes to come off for the little, the extra little strands of the eyelashes. Just duplicate the tube around, move it around, get it into place for the brow. And do the same on the other side. Duplicate things, move it around, get it in place. clay buildup to get that chin where it needs to be. Henwen has a very specific expression in the illustration. It can be a little tricky to capture. It's a little bit of a smile and some worried brows, but it gives a sense of fear or curiosity or timidity. So I do a lot of kind of fussing with the mouth and the brows, just get that expression just right. Here I inverted the mask and used the inverted part of the mask to flatten off where the pupils were and color the pupils. And now I'm going in and just painting in the irises. Or sorry, I suppose the blue part's the iris and the black part's the pupil. Anything's moved around to really wrap and hug the shapes of the eyes, the forms of the eyes. Here I decided to darken the blue, just repainting it really quickly. Sometimes when you paint, it helps to go into your pressure settings, which is that hand holding the stylus up in the top right, and set the pressure to intensity. So that way when you're painting, it has a nice kind of fall off to transparency as you let off on the stylus pressure. Here I'm going to use a cylinder tool with a slight taper on it, trim it off, and trim out the middle for the hoof. Do a little bit of refining once that trim's done after I do a voxel remesh. And these hooves are going to be really tiny, so to some degree I probably messed around with it a little bit more than necessary because they're going to be so small in this illustration. But once I have it, I can move it into place. You'll notice that I move it into place and then I switch my gizmo tool to world transform rather than local transform. And that allows me to move things in actual XY space on the XY plane rather than the axis that the cylinder was pointed at. If you're not familiar with the difference of local and world transformations, it's a very common concept in 3D applications, something you should really familiarize yourself with. Essentially, the idea is a mesh has its own axes when you turn it around. So just like we did with Henwen's head, even though we rotated the head off axis to pose it, it still had its own local X and Y symmetry on there. And so that's the local transform. And so you can move things along local transform, or you can switch it to world where you're just moving things on the world XY axis. All right, using the sharpen brush, get all the features in. I still have my lighting set from earlier with the Taran Sculpt. All right, and this is Henwen. We're going to continue on with Gurgi after this, but here you can see the Henwen sculpt all done. With Gurgi, we're going to do the same process. I'm going to save it off as a new file. I'm going to take Henwen, simple merge all the layers on him, and then I'm going to decimate way down so I don't have to really worry about, again, it becoming very memory intensive. You can see you can turn on the RAM used and all those stats, how many vertices and whatnot. So, you know, that's, if you're interested, it's worth taking a look. For the most part, I just know that if I save things off individually, turn things down, I don't have to worry about it as much. It's possible I could do just fine with all of these in the scene, but then I would end up with a scene with tons of layers. It gets hard to navigate, and plus to then move and transform around Henwen or Gurgi, I would have to select all the layers each time and rotate them. So my method is, I know I'm eventually going to render this in Blender. So I'm going to save off different files that I'll export separately into Blender. Here with Gurgi, again, same method as I used with Henwen, did some spheres for the body, used the move tool, Got some tubes now for the arms and legs going. Well, actually just the arms. Didn't really have any legs, so for the legs, there's just some simple spheres that I've voxel remeshed and used the sharp brush on to define those toes. Really, the pose is pretty tricky on those arms to get them just right. Again, I'm working off a 2D illustration, so interpreting that into 3D has its challenges. Duplicate the sphere of the head to make the nose, and then start pushing and pulling those things into place. And the sharp brush to start defining features on the face. I'll push and pull that mustache around. Once I've got Henwen and Gurgi in, I'm going to do another video on one of the trees in the background. Should be a pretty simple, straightforward video before I then move into Blender and start messing with rendering. I'm going to do some cool stuff with volumes on the rendering. I'm not going to mess with hair on Gurgi or on Taran. Instead, I'm going to leave that sculpted as it is in Nomad. Here I'm using the tubes to create the fingers, get those posed out. Very similar to what I did in the Taran hands video, if you watch the simple hands tutorial. If not, go back and check that out if you're having a hard time getting hands worked in. But this is basically the same process. Sometimes the hard thing is really, it's just at a weird angle. And pushing and pulling those points around can take a little bit of time to get dialed in. At this point, I'm going to merge the fingers and start smoothing things out. Here, I've merged everything together. So once you, actually, I guess I still have the middle finger to merge. Now it's merged. And once they're merged, there's not a lot more you can do in terms of posing those fingers, except as a whole. So I do decide to kind of move things around. It gets a little bit messy. When it gets messy, don't worry. You just need to put in some time and just keep messing with it until you get it just right. There were several times I debated just going back and reposing the fingers, but I think I eventually got it to where it needed to be. At the end of the day, this hand is a fairly small part on this entire illustration, so since it's not a focal point, I was just fine to just get these things dialed in, moved around just the way I needed them to be. But it does take some doing sometimes. Just really having some patience with yourself, using the move tool, clay buildup, sharp brush, smooth, just all the little same tips and tricks for sculpting to get it just right. There, I had to move the arm out of the way to really get the hand where I wanted. I suppose I could have turned off the visibility of the arm, but to some degree I want it to wrap around that arm. So I kind of need it there as reference. Let me know in the comments below what you think about these kind of longer, more in-depth sculpts, these multi-part sculpts. To some degree, I don't want to bore you guys to tears by having these entire process videos, but if you find them helpful, useful, then let me know. Any feedback's much appreciated. If not, we can always stick to more shorter, and I probably will for a little bit after this one, stick to some more shorter one-off videos. Here I'm using that clay buildup tool. The clay buildup tool is great for hair and fur because it just kind of layers on like thick strands. So I like to use that a lot for those things. You'll see I'll use the clay buildup tool a lot in the striations of the tree bark in the next video. All right, so I actually, lost another little bit of the Gurgi video. And here you can see I've blocked in hair. I've added basic color and gone through. I'm not really sure why sometimes I'll hit record on the iPad and then start sculpting, and who knows, like an hour or two later, I'll look and the record button's no longer flashing. If any of you guys have any clue why this happens or how to avoid this, let me know. Sometimes I just try to remember to check every once in a while, or else this happens. So apologies. Once again, it's more of the same. I did use a sphere for the top of the head. That's probably the main thing that's maybe not as explainable. I used a few spheres to kind of get those main volumes of hair and then merged them together, sculpting around with a clay buildup tool. I used my sharp move brush that I've used in other tutorials, which is basically like my sharp brush, but it's just a version of the move brush with the sharp fall off to pull out the little points of the mustache. And then I get the sharp brush to go in and further kind of work in the separation of the strands of the mustache. It's tough because I'll spend an hour or so sculpting, I'll realize that it didn't record, and then it's just a matter of, well, do I go back and re-record, or just press on? You know, as you saw, I went back and re-recorded the Henwen stuff. But since this is very much more the same, I didn't really mess with it this time on this part. And plus it was in the middle of the sculpt, so it was kind of hard to do that. Here you can see me using the sharp move brush on the tips to really get those strands pulled out. I'll eventually use a tube brush. This is very similar to what we did on Taran's hair. It's just Gurgi has a little bit more crazy strands to work in. Getting pretty close here. It's really just a matter of getting happy with the hair clumps and just refining the detail from here on out. The one thing I'm missing here that I'll add here in a little bit is the tubes for the tops of the eyelids. So those are more noticeable. And now I'll add a tube in to get some more just crazy strands that match the way you see them in the illustration. Use the tapering. Sometimes it's hard to select those tapers, so you have to really zoom in to where you can access the radius on the curve. Like, just duplicate this around, get some really specific ones in there. Again, ones that match the illustration but still look good in 3D. I probably could have made hundreds of these, but I tried to use the Move Sharp brush on a lot of the main forms of the hair, so I didn't have to end up wrestling with hundreds of different curved tubes. Using the Move tool to get things dialed in just right, and then color them. I think on this one I decided not to do the tubes on the upper lashes. I ended up just painting them black. They were kind of hidden in there anyways, so it's not that big deal. Once again, these are tiny details on a rather large illustration I'm working on. Some final strands laid in here. All right, I forgot to add in the neck. It's just a cylinder. move and rotate that. It's colored brown. This is basically it for Gurgi. Just some slight tweaks just to make sure it looks like the illustration. But here you can see he's added in, that light's still there. I like to get a little spotlight focused just on those characters. And I'll show you the turnaround that we showed at the beginning of the video. Let me know how you like this video. Like, comment, subscribe, same as always. And join me for the next part. Well, I will do one of the scary trees in the background. It'll be a short one, and then we'll hop into Blender to finish it off. I hope you'll look forward to that, and I'll talk to you in the next video.